45 years ago, a promise was made to increase education funding in the state. It was to come from the proceeds of the Illinois Lottery. The lottery was modeled after a game that had been played in the black community for decades called policy.
Policy was not only a vice, it was a major source of income. In tonight's cover story, Tanya Francisco explains how the creation of the Illinois State Lottery destroyed the black community's economic base.
One more, quickly.
Quick pick, spots,
$20, $60, right?
straight. It's the language of the lottery. Long before Lotto, Mega Millions, and Powerball, there was the language of policy.
There was the stovepipe bet, there was the gig, there was the saddle. There's all these colorful names for all these variety of bets.
Nathan Thompson is the resident expert on policy.
Today's state lotteries are modeled on the success of the black policy and numbers operations.
In 2005, he self-published an informal history on policy and the multi-millionaires called kings who ran the game from 1885 up until the 1970s. To play policy, people would place bets as little as a penny or a nickel on various number combinations that were pulled twice a day and published on thousands of little slips of paper that could always be found blowing through the streets of Bronzeville.
If you got three numbers and you paid a nickel, you get $100.
Charles Bowen grew up in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood, a place considered by many to be the policy capital, even though other black-centric cities like Harlem in New York, Cleveland and Detroit were also into running numbers. There were dozens of so-called policy wheels spinning around the city with catchy names like Room and Board, Atlantic and Pacific, and Baltimore and Ohio.
My grandmother was well over into policy, played every day.
In 1960, Charles Bowen was in charge of the gambling and vice units of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. He led hundreds of raids and arrested dozens of policy kings. He got a call after one raid from his grandmother saying she wanted to see him.
She said, "You raided the room and board yesterday, and you cost me $300. She says, raid some other wheel. She said, "You got authority." She said, "You raid some other wheel. Don't raid mine."
Bowen walked a fine line as a black man living in Bronzeville and working in law enforcement.
Policy was our lifeblood. It flourished. The funeral homes, the banks, whatever we had, if you trace the money back, it came from policy.
And from policy came policy kings, the men who ran the game. Men like John Mushmouth Johnson, the Jones brothers, and Ted Rowe.
Well, the policy kings were the pillars of the community.
Angela Ford is the founder of the Obsidian Collection, a digital museum of black history.
These policy kings were educated. They were educated men running an enterprise.
An enterprise that funded thousands of mom and pop stores and other more well-known businesses like Supreme Life Insurance Company, Providence Hospital, Burr Oak Cemetery, and dozens of black-owned newspapers.
The first 12 black certified public accountants in America came out of the policy business.
And on a larger scale, policy-funded ventures like the Negro Baseball League, aviator Bessie Coleman, and boxers Joe Louis and Jack Johnson.
You're talking about the first half of last century where collectively black men were generating upwards of $200 and $300 million annually.
Bronzeville's economic success even caught the attention of Time magazine in 1938, in which a columnist wrote, "Bronzeville was the center of U.S. Negro business." Policy, even though it was outlawed in 1905, was the financial engine that was making it all happen.
They were businessmen, and they controlled the business in our community.
Howard Brookins Sr. is the founder of Brookins Funeral Home.
There was no black banks. You could go to them guys, explain to you what they wanted, and they could then loan you the money to go into business.
So it was gambling. Let's call it what it is.
Charles Bethea is the director of collections and curatorial affairs at the Chicago History Museum.
Some people looked at them as Robin Hoods of their time because the money that they did make, granted off the backs of other people, they did literally put it back into the community with legitimate businesses that fueled the economic growth and stimulation of the community itself.
But a bloody and at times deadly war with the Italian mafia led to many of the policy kings retiring or just leaving town.
We've made enough money, you know. We can't watch anybody else die, you know. So one by one, they got into other things.
In 1973, with the mob firmly in control, State Representative Lewis Caldwell proposed legalizing policy, saying it was better that the money go into the state treasury than into the pockets of fat cat syndicate crooks.
How do you play the lottery's new daily game? Simple.
On July 1st, 1974, policy became the Illinois State Lottery, with promises to put the proceeds into education funding.
Pick the winning number on TV. You could win up to $500.
I remember the promise. And so fast forward, me explaining to my son why we just closed 60 schools when the lottery has hundreds of millions of dollars.
The top 10 zip codes in the state of Illinois that play lottery are black zip codes, predominantly black zip codes. But that money's not finding its way back into black neighborhoods. That's a problem.
Was a killer to the black community.
When they made it legal, it did, because it took money out of the community that wasn't coming from any other source, legal or otherwise.
These have become so difficult to find.
Once plentiful, policy slips are now hard to come by. Even more rare are the presses that used to print them. Charles Bowen has both. Two faded slips from 1920 and a press from 1895.
I don't think we ever really thought of policy ever going out of business, to be honest.
I often wondered if we had maintained that era, how far could we have went in life with it?
Many compare the story of policy to what's happening now with marijuana. Both considered illegal and immoral at one time, but once it was legalized and the name was changed, policy to lottery and weed to cannabis, it was okay and it was good for the economy. But what remains to be seen is legalized marijuana's impact on the black community. Tanya Francisco, WGN News.
Yeah, I remember my dad told me about policy, talked about it, how it was so prevalent back then. You know?
What a fascinating look back at history. I love that story. Great job from Tanya. Thank you very much.
Still had the city of Chicago.